While walking through their backyard one afternoon, a couple stumbled upon a buried book, and inside its worn, dusty pages, they noticed something completely unexpected and deeply shocking. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you are watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have a special story for you. John and Betty lived in a quiet house near the edge of town. Their backyard was large and filled with old trees, tall grass, and small patches of flowers. It was the kind of place where birds sang in the morning and squirrels ran from branch to branch. They often took walks there in the evenings, enjoying the calm air and each other's company. Their dog, Max, a golden retriever with a playful spirit, always joined them. One afternoon, the weather was mild. The sun was out and the breeze moved gently through the leaves. John and Betty decided to take Max for a short walk around the yard. It was something they did often, and nothing about that day seemed different at first. As they reached the back edge of the yard, Max suddenly stopped. He sniffed the ground near an old oak tree and began to dig. At first, they didn't pay much attention. Max liked to dig from time to time, usually after spotting a squirrel or smelling something odd. But this time, he didn't stop. He kept digging in the same spot, dirt flying behind him as his paws worked fast. John noticed the ground looked slightly raised in that area, almost like something was buried there. He crouched down and began to help Max dig. Betty joined him. The soil was soft, and after a few minutes, John's hand hit something hard. He brushed the dirt away and found a corner of metal sticking out. They cleared more soil and slowly pulled out a rusted metal box. The box was small but heavy, and it looked old. Its surface was covered with rust, and the hinges creaked as John carefully opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was an old leather book. The book looked fragile, and the leather was cracked from age. They brought it back to the porch where there was more light. Betty gently unwrapped the cloth and opened the book. The pages were yellowed and dry. Most of the writing had faded, making the words hard to read. Some pages were torn at the edges, and others were stuck together. Still, they turned each page slowly, trying to make out whatever they could. It seemed like a journal or maybe notes from someone who had lived long ago. As they flipped through the book, something fell out. It was a folded piece of paper tucked between two pages. The paper was dry but still strong. When they opened it, they saw that it was a hand-drawn map. The lines were dark and clear, showing trees, hills, and a path that curved toward a marked spot. At the top of the page was a symbol that looked like a compass. Near the bottom, there was a small drawing of what looked like a house or building. John and Betty stared at the map, trying to match it with the area around their home. The layout looked familiar. The path seemed to lead to a place not far from where they lived, maybe just beyond the woods that bordered the backyard. It wasn't detailed, but it was clear enough to show that the location was nearby. They held the map between them for a while, unsure of what it meant. The book had not offered much information, but this map felt like it was pointing them towards something. It was strange to find such a thing hidden in their own backyard, buried beneath an old oak tree that had likely stood there for decades. The idea that someone long ago had left the box there made them feel curious and a little nervous. Max sat nearby, watching them closely. He wagged his tail as if waiting for the next adventure. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the yard, but the air was still warm. John folded the map carefully and slipped it back inside the book. Betty wrapped the cloth back around it and held the box in her arms. They did not know who had buried it or how long it had been there. But one thing was certain, this was not just an old book. It was the beginning of something they hadn't expected. And now, with a map in their hands and questions in their minds, they began to wonder what might be waiting at the end of the path. The next morning, the sky was gray but calm. John and Betty sat at the kitchen table, the old book and the folded map between them. They had barely slept, their minds full of thoughts about what they had found. The book was still fragile and the pages had not revealed much, but the map stayed in their thoughts. It seemed to point to a place not far from their home. The trees and hills drawn on it looked similar to the wooded area behind their property. John studied the map closely and noticed a path marked with a line that curved through the trees. At the end of the path was a small drawing that looked like a building. There were no words, only shapes and lines. Still, it gave them enough to understand the direction. The location looked close enough to reach on foot. They decided to follow the path and see where it led. After breakfast, they dressed in light jackets and hiking boots. Betty folded the map carefully and placed it in her pocket. Max waited by the door, excited for another walk. The three of them left the house and headed toward the tree line behind their backyard. The grass was wet with morning dew and the air smelled fresh. They entered the woods slowly. The trees were tall and thick, their leaves blocking much of the sky. The ground was uneven, with fallen branches and old roots stretching across the path. Birds called from above and the sound of their steps echoed softly through the trees. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. As they walked, John compared the map to their surroundings. They passed a group of large rocks that matched the ones shown on the map. Then they crossed a narrow stream, just as the drawing had indicated. The map had no scale, but it seemed like they were getting close. The trail narrowed and the trees began to open up ahead. After nearly an hour of walking, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood an old farmhouse. The building looked forgotten, like no one had been there for years. The roof was partly caved in and ivy had spread across the walls. The windows were cracked or broken. The door hung slightly open, moving gently with the wind. There were no signs of people, no fresh tracks in the dirt. Grass and weeds had grown tall around the house. The air was still. Max walked slowly, ears up and nose low to the ground. John and Betty stood for a moment, taking in the sight. The farmhouse looked quiet, but something about it made them pause. They stepped closer, walking around the outside first. Vines climbed up the corners and pieces of wood from the porch had rotted away. The paint on the walls had peeled off long ago, leaving behind a dull gray color. One of the shutters dangled from a single hinge, tapping gently against the wall when the breeze picked up. John pushed the door open wider. It creaked and dust floated in the air as light entered the hallway. The inside was dim and cold. They stepped carefully through the doorway, Max following close behind. The floor beneath their feet was rough and creaked with every step. The smell of old wood and damp air filled the space. The hallway led into a larger room. There were broken chairs, a table with one leg missing, and torn curtains still hanging in the windows. The ceiling had cracks and the wallpaper had curled off the walls in many places. Cobwebs filled the corners and dust covered every surface. John and Betty moved slowly, eyes scanning the space. It was clear no one had been there in many years. The silence inside the farmhouse was deep, broken only by the sound of their own steps and the soft breathing of Max. They looked through the rooms one by one, walking through the old kitchen, a small sitting room, and what looked like a bedroom with a broken bed frame in one corner. Every room told the same story: abandonment, silence, and time passing without anyone noticing. Yet they kept going, wondering what this house had once been and why it had been marked on the map. Each step deeper into the house brought more questions. They had no answers yet, but something about the place felt important. The book, the map, the trail, all of it had led to this moment. And now, standing in the middle of the old farmhouse, John and Betty knew this was only the beginning of whatever was waiting to be found. In the far corner of the house, past a narrow hallway, they noticed something different. A wooden door, half hidden by a fallen shelf, stood against the wall. It was smaller than the others and seemed older. John moved the shelf aside. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that came from the opening was colder. It smelled like earth and metal. The stairs looked unstable, but they held. John went first, moving slowly with each step. Betty followed close behind, holding a flashlight. Max stayed at the top for a moment, then followed. The basement was low and cramped. The walls were made of rough stone and the ground was dirt. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling. Old tools and boxes were scattered across the floor. Some were broken. Others had rotted from damp air. The light from the flashlight passed over rusty saws, bent nails, and wooden crates stacked in corners. In one corner of the basement, behind a pile of cracked boards, something caught their eye. It was a large chest, covered in dust and half buried under old junk. The chest was made of dark wood with metal edges. The metal was rusted and the lock was thick, but the shape was strong. It had been hidden well. John cleared the debris slowly. The chest was heavy. Its lid was marked with scratches and the lock had almost turned orange from years of rust. They examined it quietly. Betty found a broken tool nearby that could be used to pry it open. With care, they worked on the lock, slowly loosening the metal. After several tries, it gave way with a sharp snap. The lid creaked as it opened. Inside the chest, there was no dust. Everything had been protected. On top were layers of old papers, some folded neatly, others loose. Underneath the papers were small leather pouches tied with string. Next to them, photographs were stacked carefully. The photos were faded, their edges curled, but they showed people in old clothes standing near what looked like the farmhouse. Some wore hats and boots. Some held shovels. Most looked serious. Beneath the papers and photos, the chest held something more unusual. Dozens of shiny gold coins filled the bottom layer. They were different sizes, some smooth and some marked with strange patterns. Despite their age, the coins still shined under the flashlight. The gold had not faded. It looked untouched by time. John and Betty stood over the chest, their eyes moving from the coins to the photos, then to the papers. Each item felt like a message from the past. They did not know who the people in the pictures were or what the papers said, but it was clear that the chest had been hidden on purpose. Someone had wanted to keep these things safe. And now, after so many years, they had been found again. Among the papers and coins, something caught Betty's eye. It was a small folded note tucked neatly between two thick envelopes. The paper was yellowed with age but still held together. She opened it carefully, making sure not to tear it. The writing was faded but still readable in most places. The words were written in a neat hand and the ink had turned brown over time. The note began by introducing the man who wrote it. His name was Samuel Briggs. He had once lived in the very farmhouse where they now stood. The letter explained that Samuel had lived during the time of the gold rush. At first, he had worked as a miner, digging in rough hills and cold streams like everyone else. But over time, he had started to notice a problem. Many miners were losing their gold. Some were robbed. Others were tricked. Some simply vanished without a trace, their savings gone. Samuel saw this happening again and again. He knew how hard the miners worked. He knew the risk they took every day. Most of them had no safe place to keep their gold. They trusted the wrong people or buried it in the wrong spots. Samuel thought he could help. The note explained how he began offering to keep the gold for them. At first, only a few miners agreed. But as time passed, more and more came to him. The letter told how Samuel had slowly earned their trust. He used secret hiding spots to store the gold. He never charged more than what was fair. He always returned what was given to him. As his name spread, miners started traveling from far places just to meet him. They knew he was honest. They believed he would not steal from them. Over time, he became more than just a former miner, he became a banker, even if it wasn't official. Samuel had used his farmhouse as a safe place. The note said that he kept detailed records and took great care with everything he stored. He wanted the miners to feel that their gold was safer with him than anywhere else. The letter did not brag. It did not try to make him sound like a hero. Instead, it explained the facts with simple words. It was clear that Samuel cared deeply about doing what was right. The letter mentioned that the chest John and Betty found was one of his trusted storage spots. It had been packed during a time when many miners were leaving the area. Samuel had decided to protect what had been left behind. The note explained that he had hidden the chest himself, sealing it carefully and placing it in the basement to keep it safe from fire, water, and theft. He had not planned for it to be lost forever. The note ended with a few thoughts from Samuel written in a more personal tone. He hoped that whoever found the chest would understand the purpose behind it. He hoped the person would not see it only as gold and paper, but as something built on trust. He asked the reader to take care in what they did next. John and Betty finished reading the note in silence. The paper was thin, but the meaning behind it was heavy. They now knew the name of the man behind the chest. They knew that Samuel Briggs had not been a rich businessman or a famous leader. He had simply been someone who tried to help others in a time when help was hard to find. The letter gave the chest meaning. The coins were not just treasure. The papers were not just old records. Together, they were a part of Samuel's life, hidden away and now brought to light. John folded the note again, carefully placing it back in the chest. The story of the man who once lived in the farmhouse had finally been heard again. John and Betty continued to look through the items inside the chest. Under the note about Samuel Briggs, there were more papers and photographs. Some were hard to read, but others were clear. The handwriting was old and the ink had faded in places, but the meaning could still be understood. One group of papers stood out from the rest. They were letters, each signed by different people. The letters were short and simple, but filled with emotion. They were thank you notes sent to Samuel by men who had trusted him with their gold. These letters told small pieces of many different stories. Some men said they had nearly lost everything before meeting Samuel. Others explained how they had been robbed in the past but finally felt safe once their gold was placed in his care. A few letters spoke of family and how the gold Samuel had protected helped them return home or start a better life. The writers did not know each other, but all of them wrote with the same feeling. They trusted Samuel. He had helped them in a way few others would. As John and Betty read through the letters, they began to see how much Samuel's actions had mattered. He was not simply guarding money. He was helping people hold on to what they had worked so hard to earn. He became a part of their survival during a time when many people lived with risk and fear. Beside the letters, there were several maps. These maps were small and hand-drawn. Some were torn, others folded many times. The drawings showed simple lines, trees, and marks that looked like hiding spots. Each map seemed to point to a different place. On one, there was a drawing of a large rock near a stream. On another, a hollow tree was shown beside a trail. A few maps had names of towns or directions marked in faded pencil. John and Betty realized that these were not just random sketches. They were guides to more places where Samuel had hidden gold. It became clear that the farmhouse basement was not the only hiding place. Samuel had created a system using landmarks and nature to hide the treasures safely. He must have known that times were uncertain. It was not enough to lock things in a box. He had taken the extra step to spread the risk, creating a secret network of spots only he could understand. These maps were the proof. Some of the maps had small notes on them written in tiny handwriting. The notes were simple, saying things like "safe for now" or "return before snow." Others had names next to them, possibly belonging to the miners who had left their gold in those spots. Samuel had not kept this system for himself. He had used it to protect the gold of others, storing each piece where it would be less likely to be found by thieves or destroyed by time. There were also symbols used in the maps. Small stars, circles, and lines that seemed to mark distances or warnings. It looked like Samuel had made his own code. He probably used it to keep track of which spot belonged to which miner and when it needed to be checked again. The work showed careful thought and planning. Nothing was done in a rush. Samuel had taken this task seriously as if it were his true calling. John and Betty placed the maps side by side on the floor. Some looked more recent while others were very old. They wondered how many people had been helped by this system. It was hard to say, but judging by the number of letters and maps, it had not been a small effort. Samuel had spent years building this system, one hiding place at a time. The chest had not just held gold and papers. It had held a hidden world, one where trust and honor were more important than contracts and banks. Samuel had worked quietly without seeking praise or reward. His goal had been simple: to help honest workers keep what they had earned. John and Betty looked at the chest again with new understanding. It was not just a treasure box. It was part of something bigger, something made with care, patience, and a strong belief in doing the right thing. Samuel Briggs had built something that lasted longer than his lifetime. And now, piece by piece, it was being revealed again. Samuel had spent years helping others. He had carefully hidden gold in safe places and kept track of every name and every location. But these pages showed something else: plans he had made for the future. He wanted to do more than just guard gold. He had a larger goal. He wanted to build a real bank. He wrote about a nearby town that was growing fast. New families were arriving and businesses were opening. There were no proper banks yet, only people trying to manage money on their own. Samuel believed that a trusted bank could make life better for everyone. It would give miners and workers a safe place to keep their savings. It would bring trust and stability to the town. He had started planning everything. He listed possible locations in the town. He described how the building should look. He even wrote ideas about how the bank should operate, what rules to follow, how to serve people fairly, and how to protect what was given to him. It was clear he had thought deeply about it. The notes were full of hope and care. But then his writing began to change. Later entries were shorter and harder to read. The handwriting was weaker and the words were not as steady. One page explained that he had fallen ill. At first, he thought it was just a passing sickness. He believed he would get better soon and return to work. But as the pages went on, it was clear that his health was not improving. He had become too weak to travel. The roads to the town were rough and the weather made things harder. He could not visit the places he had marked on his maps. He could not meet with the people he had once helped. His dream of starting the bank had to be delayed again and again. In one entry, he wrote about sitting by the window of the farmhouse, watching the trees outside, and wondering if someone else might one day continue what he had started. He did not sound angry or sad. He sounded tired but calm. He seemed to accept that he might not finish what he had hoped for. The final pages were few. The last one simply said that everything had been left where it was safe, but waiting. He wrote that he hoped someone honest would find it someday and understand its purpose. Then the writing stopped. John and Betty placed the pages down carefully. The chest, once full of treasure and plans, now felt heavier in a different way. Samuel had built something strong with his own hands and had protected it with great care. But he never got the chance to complete his vision. Time and illness had stopped him before he could bring it to life. His work had remained hidden, untouched, and unknown for over 100 years. No one had come looking for it. No one had followed the maps. It had simply stayed where he left it, buried in the quiet of the farmhouse basement. His name had not been remembered in books. His dream of a bank had never opened. But through his words, his story was now known again. What they had found was not just about gold. It was about a man who had seen a problem and tried to fix it. A man who worked in silence, thinking more about others than himself. A man who built something meaningful and left it behind with hope. Even though his dream was never completed, the effort he made still mattered. And now, after so many years, that effort had finally been seen. They considered what to do next. The story of Samuel Briggs was not in any book they had ever read. No one had told his story in schools or museums. It was as if he had vanished with time, his kindness and efforts buried along with his chest. But now someone knew. Now someone could remember. They knew they could tell others. They could alert local historians or reach out to people who study the gold rush period. Someone might want to see the chest, read the letters, or study the maps. But they also knew that telling the world might change everything. The farmhouse might be torn down, searched, or even destroyed in the process. The quiet that had kept Samuel's secret safe for so long could be broken. They also thought about keeping it private. They could protect the chest and its contents. They could store the letters, take pictures of the maps, and guard the gold in a safe place. They had no desire to sell it. It felt wrong to treat it like a prize. It was too meaningful for that. But was it right to keep such a story hidden again? Whatever they chose, they understood one thing for certain: their lives had changed. A simple walk in the backyard had led to a buried book. That book had led to a map. The map had led to an old farmhouse, and inside it, the life of a forgotten man had been waiting to be found. They felt connected to Samuel now. Not by blood, but by discovery. They had uncovered the final piece of his quiet mission. They had seen his work, read his words, and stood in the house where he once lived. They had become the witnesses of a story no one else knew. Max stood up and stretched. Dust floated in the flashlight beam as John and Betty packed the papers back into the chest one by one. They did it slowly and carefully, treating each item with respect. When they closed the lid, they both looked around the basement one last time. The place felt different now. It was still dark and broken, but it held meaning. It was not just an old house anymore. It was part of something deeper. A hidden part of history. A message from the past. John and Betty left the farmhouse with full hearts and quiet thoughts. What they had found would stay with them forever, not just the treasure, but the story of a man who helped others and asked for nothing in return. Samuel Briggs had lived, worked, and died in silence. But now his story had a voice again. And that voice would never be forgotten.